For millions of years, man was only a minor figure on this beautiful planet, an animal competing for food and living space in a world which had both in abundance. But even as his generations migrated across the globe, still the world remained largely unaware of his presence, until he invented the first tool. Through the use of tools, man extended the range and strength of his arms, giving him the capability to mold his environment to suit his needs. From this moment on, his climb to power on the planet accelerated. And then, to clinch the matter, there came the machine, amplifying the power of his muscles 1,000-fold and more. In one great surge, man became at once the supreme ruler and the supreme despoiler of his planet. The Industrial Revolution changed the face of the world at a breathtaking pace. Hills and valleys which had remained unchanged since the beginning of time were torn apart in the quest for mineral wealth. It's easy to forget the scope of this change, mainly because we're not really a part of it anymore. But to get an idea of its scale, it's only necessary to look at countries that were directly affected by it. Britain, Germany, the USA, which enjoy amazingly high standards of living. And compare this with the countries of Central Africa and Southeast Asia, which were never touched by it. And now we're on the brink of the computer revolution. It'll run its course not in a century, but in 1 or 2 decades. It's an era when we'll amplify the power of our brains many, many times in the way that the machines of 100 years ago amplified the power of our muscles. Most people know by now that a microprocessor, or a chip as it's often called, is an incredibly tiny computer. And there's a general feeling that it represents a dramatic breakthrough in technology. But few realize just how dramatic. Commercial computers have been around for about 1/4 of a century, and they've increased in power and efficiency, shrunk in size and cost on a scale which is almost incredible. If the same advances had taken place in the motor car industry, today you'd be able to buy this Rolls-Royce for £1.65. How many miles do you think it would do to the gallon? About 3 million. And if you were interested in miniaturization, which you wouldn't be, you could get 3 of them on a pin's head. Most people's reactions to this is fantastic, but so what? Who wants all these cheap computers anyway, and what possible good can they do for me? To understand that, we need to know something about what a computer is, what it does, and what it can and will do. We're not going to be talking a lot of incomprehensible technology, which fortunately isn't necessary for one to understand the significance of the microprocessor. All one needs to know is the basic principle of how a machine can count.
5 little monkeys played on the shore. One went sailing and then there were 4. 4 little monkeys.
As soon as man achieved even the simplest form of communal society, he needed to count.
And then there were 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Now, the essence of counting is that you represent numbers of amounts by physical things. Simplest of all, you could use your fingers and your thumbs. And in all probability, this is why we count in tens. Anyway, the real point to grasp is that one can represent numbers or amounts in the form of physical things, whether they're bits of rock, fingers, or in the case of the abacus, beads on a frame. When one writes down a number, one's doing much the same thing, and using particular rules, one can even calculate. As human society became more and more complex, the need for calculations grew, and those few people who were trained in accounting found themselves overloaded with work.
The first person to actually try to do something about this was the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, who as a young man had watched his father, who was an income tax collector, toiling through the night on endless calculations. Now, what Pascal realized was that it ought to be possible to build a machine to add and subtract automatically by constructing a set of interlocking gears, each of which had 10 teeth to represent the numbers 0 through 9. And this is actually a copy of Pascal's device. It's really enormously clever. You dial in the numbers that you want to add, subtract, and so on, and lo and behold, the answer comes up in these windows. The principle is rather similar to the way a car's mileometer works. One wheel revolves slowly, completing a circuit each 1/10 of a mile. As it does so, a lever comes out and hits an adjoining wheel, advancing it 1/10 of a revolution. The first wheel goes round again, advances the second a further 1/10, and so on. The total number of revolutions, or the distance traveled by the car, is recorded in a window at the front. So that's the principle to Pascaline. It really should have worked, but actually it didn't catch on. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. One is that it was rather an expensive device to build. Secondly, it was mechanically unreliable. It's also been said that the accountants and clerks at the time objected to it because it was going to put them out of work.
By the early 19th century, with the advance of science and international trade, it was obvious that the resources of orthodox counting and calculation were becoming strained. And in 1810, one man decided that something would have to be done about it. His name was Charles Babbage, and he was the father and the prophet of the computer age. Babbage was an eccentric gentleman scientist of a kind that it's almost impossible to find today. He became obsessed with the enormous problem facing the compilers of scientific tables at the time. That's tables to calculate tides, astronomical observations, structural engineering problems, and so on. He set out to build a giant calculating machine. He called it the difference engine, made out of an unheard-of number of cogs, wheels, and interconnecting parts. It would be capable of solving differential equations, which was a task far more elaborate than anything that had ever been attempted before. What Babbage realized was that once a machine was capable of performing one complex type of calculation, there was no reason in principle why you couldn't design a machine to solve any kind of calculation. And he used punched cards of the kind that Jacquard used to control the weaving pattern of his machines. These machines, incidentally, also provoked industrial action on the part of the weavers of the time, the Luddites, who feared that they would be flung out of work as a result of his invention.
No doubt there would have been an enormous fuss if Babbage's analytical engine, as he called his universal computer, had actually been put to work. Well, a team of expert mechanics did set out to build part of it, and a careful study of Babbage's intricate designs suggests that in principle it would have worked. But despite the injection of his own considerable fortune and the help of numerous friends, including the beautiful and talented mathematician Ada, Countess of Lovelace, the device was never completed.
So what went wrong? Well, Babbage himself ultimately lost heart in the scheme because he'd realized that the workmanship of the time just wasn't up to the task required of it. And even if the whole system had been put together, there would always have been some part which was simply out of adjustment. The trouble was that the method of calculation he was using, decimal, meant that all the components had to have 10 teeth, and that each of these had to interlock with hundreds of others. The thing was simply too complex to have worked.
In 1871, Charles Babbage died, a disappointed man. he'd had a glimpse of a future that he would never see. He'd been considered to be so remarkable that when he did die, a leading surgeon was commissioned to examine his brain to see if it differed in any way from that of other men. Well, he couldn't find any differences, but they preserved his brain for posterity. And here it is. And here, sitting on top of it, is a glimpse of the stunning future which he missed. A tiny computer, no bigger than a fingernail.
10 years or so before Babbage's death, the United States government were facing a major problem. At that time, they decided that a census should be taken every 10 years to keep track of the nation's expanding population. But so many immigrants were arriving in America that the authorities were still dealing with statistics 7 years old. Obviously, a new counting method would have to be found, and at last someone came up with a brilliant idea. Herman Hollerith dramatically proposed the data should be counted by machine.
The Hollerith system used the same kind of card method that was actually used to control the Jacquard loom. What you have is a special card punched out specially for each individual, a hole in a particular position, meaning a particular detail about that person. For example, that hole there might be their age, that their sex, that their occupation, that their ethnic group, and so on. All this was pre-punched, of course, one card for each individual. The card was inserted in this gadget here. Now, this consists of two parts. Up on the top, an array of needles, below a bath of mercury. Now, when this is lowered, most of the needles, of course, get blocked by the card, but some actually pass through the holes, make connection with the bath of mercury, make an electrical connection, and score up on these clocks up here. So let's see it go. That's right. They score up, and in fact, a little compartment opens up, and you drop in the particular card. This must be the first mechanical sorter, I suppose. Well, the whole thing was a great success. The American census was completed in record time, and Mr. Hollerith went on to build up a big business based on this and other forms of mechanical sorting and counting machines.
By the First World War, automatic calculators were in widespread use, but they were still all decimal mechanical systems, barely more than elaborate versions of Pascal's original invention. And things might have gone on developing slowly in this way had it not been for one man. When Hitler plunged the world into a second major war, he unwittingly set in motion the computer age. For their military communications, the Germans had invented a machine called the Enigma, with a virtually uncrackable code system. So, at a Buckinghamshire country house, a top-secret team of British scientists and mathematicians were given the order to beat Enigma. The first mechanical computers they used were far too slow, until someone had the idea of using electronics, and it was this that was to prove the turning point for the computer revolution. The basic unit was the valve, or an electronic switch, a device which even then could switch on and off thousands of times a second. And with this came a new counting system, binary. These are the kinds of numbers we're all familiar with, but they're difficult and time-consuming for a computer to handle. Instead, it uses only two numbers, 0 and 1. Because a computer is simply a vast collection of electronic switches, all it needs to know is when a current is off or on. 0 equals off, and 1 equals on. It may seem a long-winded way of going about things, but don't forget that these switches are operating or counting at tremendous speeds. The computer equivalent of our everyday numbers may look rather odd, but it was the use of this binary or two-digit system that really launched computers as we now know them. The British Colossus computer was the first and the most successful. It cracked the Enigma code without the Germans knowing it, and some people believe helped to win the war. The British, in fact, developed some very successful computers. But soon the Americans, with their huge defense budgets, coupled with their mighty industrial muscle, began to move inexorably into the lead. Progress was slow, and computers were still cumbersome, unreliable, expensive, and dependent upon the temperamental and power-hungry valve as their basic unit of operation. And then, in 1948, scientists at Bell Laboratories invented the transistor.
For most people, a transistor is a little radio set, but that's a misuse of the word. A transistor is actually a tiny switching circuit which can be used as the basic calculating unit of a computer, and it's very much smaller and more reliable than a valve. Here's a valve, and this is a transistor. In fact, this is rather a larger transistor, and it's a characteristic of them that you can make them extremely small, so small that you need a microscope to see them. In fact, on this chip, there are 10,000 transistors.
Transistorized computer power allowed people to use them for all sorts of applications, and among the first were bank accounts. Then followed wages slips and stock control. In fact, any number of complex or routine calculations became possible. But despite all these advances, they were still essentially big, expensive and rare beasts, unlikely to have any impact on the world at large. And then, in October 1957, came the launching of the first Russian satellite, Sputnik 1. It astonished the world, and they followed it almost immediately by the launching of a dog, Laika. This was all possible because they'd developed huge booster rockets, far more powerful than anything the Americans had or would have for at least a decade. And for a while, it looked as if Soviet science had triumphed. The Americans, on the other hand, who'd been overconfident of their technological superiority, had a succession of humiliating failures.
And it was here, on this now deserted and decaying site, that a series of disastrous launches led them to totally rethink their space program.
This orbit is 11119er.
They had too much to lose in terms of national pride and international prestige to fail again. So in 1960, President Kennedy announced that billions of dollars were going to be spent in putting a man on the moon by the end of that decade. Well, we all know the outcome of that and how sensationally and convincingly the Americans won the space race. But what's less well understood is that the triumph of beating the Russians to the moon was by no means the most important spin-off. In the early days, when their rockets were relatively puny, the Americans had to think small, miniaturizing their electronics in the most inventive and radical way. The Russians could have put the kitchen sink into orbit, and judging by the design of their spaceships, they did so. The Americans didn't have the boosting power, but they ended up with the microprocessor.
Once again, the huge American industrial potential showed its muscles, bringing mass production methods to the new generation of miniaturized computers. Gradually, the density of transistors that could be packed onto a single chip of silicon began to rise dramatically. First, just 10, then 50, then hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Today, we're talking about the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of transistors, and on the drawing boards are plans for chips with 1 million switching components. This means that today's pocket calculators, costing only a few pounds, are doing the same job as the early computers, costing hundreds of thousands more.
The first mechanical calculators could perform one or two calculations or operations in a second. The first electronic ones, literally thousands. Then came the transistor and speeds pushed up to 1 million a second. And today we've got computers that can perform 1 billion operations a second easily. Do you know what 1 billion is? Well, it's 1,000 million, but most people don't really have any idea what that means. Suppose we have an eccentric billionaire who decides to give £1 billion away. He hands over £1 to each person, working at a rate of 1 every 10 seconds, and for an 8-hour day, 5 days a week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, pretend that he'd just this moment given away his last £1. When do you think he gave away his first? At the time of the Silver Jubilee, perhaps? No, earlier than that. What about the first American moon landing? No, earlier. Well, the Queen's coronation? No. Hitler's invasion of Poland, perhaps? No. The First World War? No, even that's not early enough. Queen Victoria's funeral? Back further. The Battle of Waterloo? No, the billionaire would still have been at work. The Great Fire of London? No, he'd have been handing out pound notes through the flames. The Battle of Hastings in 1066? No, still further back. Well, I'll put you out of your misery. The billionaire would have handed over his first £1 on July the 24th, 652 AD. And this little microprocessor is capable of calculating 1 billion times a second. Now, what this amounts to is that we're already making computers which will operate millions of times faster than the brain, that will store masses of information in an area hardly larger than a pin's head, performing many of the tasks that the brain can perform, but which can be rushed off the mass production line at a cost of a few pennies each. Now, no one should doubt that this will give us the capacity to change our world. In the next 5 programs, we're going to be looking at some of these changes, at the effects on employment, on leisure, on education, on politics, even on the future of our society. Join us to find out what these changes will be and whether they'll be for the better or for the worse.
I'm Lawrence Moore, the producer of The Mighty Micro. Sadly, just as we were completing these films, our writer and presenter, Dr. Christopher Evans, died. A scientist in his own right, he had the knack of being able to convey often complicated scientific ideas simply and directly, as is shown in his book, The Mighty Micro, on which these films are based. All of us associated with these programs would like to dedicate the series to him.